tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Imagine that your favorite tomatoes are missing from your dinner table. This isn't just a problem for some Americans, it's a reality that is becoming increasingly tangible. Starting in 2025, the US began imposing new tariffs on tomatoes imported from Mexico, raising the tax to 17%. But what if I told you that these tomatoes have already started disappearing from store shelves and their price has risen by 30%? What does this mean for the US economy? How will it change the daily lives of Americans? And why have Mexicans found a new market where they are offered stability and respect? This is not just a story about how countries wage trade wars. It is a story about how one of North America's most important agricultural industries is already changing the rules of the game.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Starting in 2025, the US, by imposing sanctions on Mexican tomatoes, may lose not only a stable supply of food, but also the trust of its closest neighbor. Mexico, which supplies 90% of America's tomatoes, has been hit hard. Now a 17% tax will be levied on every kilogram of fresh tomatoes crossing the border. This blow to a business that seemed unshakable in relations between the two countries has forced Mexico to look for new ways forward, and they have found them in Canada. Quietly and without fuss, Mexican farmers have begun to redirect their supplies to their neighbor, which, to the surprise of many, has welcomed them with open arms.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
What are the consequences for American consumers? A sharp rise in the price of tomatoes and other goods that cannot be delivered on time is becoming a problem for everyone who is used to affordable prices. But here it is worth considering, the US may lose not only income, but also trust both from its neighbors and from its own citizens. How long will Americans be able to pay more for what they used to buy at the used Uber? And how will all this affect the country's future food security?
That's a 10. That's a good one.
Now imagine that Mexico no longer needs America for its supplies because it has found a more stable and reliable partner, Canada. Yes, the very same Canada that America once considered secondary is now actively pushing its way into a market that once seemed unattainable. How did it happen that peaceful and loyal Canada came out on top, while the US is on the verge of losing its most important source of food? Watch our video to see how political decisions and economic sanctions can affect global supply chains, who won the trade war, and why this case could mark the beginning of the end of American dominance in the agricultural sector.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Since 2025, the US has been facing a new economic crisis that has caught many by surprise. Instead of solemnly opening new horizons for trade relations, the country found itself on the verge of losing one of its most important agricultural supplies. Tomatoes from Mexico, which account for 90% of all tomatoes sold in the US, have now become a source of conflict due to a new tax, a 17% tariff on every kilogram of fresh tomatoes imported from the neighboring country. This tax is not just an economic measure, but a blow to the long-standing relationship between two neighbors who had cooperated in the agricultural sector for decades.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
For the U.S., Mexican tomatoes are not just a food product. They are the basis for many industries, from the restaurant business to large grocery chains. Mexico has been supplying America with tomatoes since the 1980s, when American farmers in some states were unable to compete with cheap labor and optimal climatic conditions in the South. The Mexican tomato market became stable and reliable, providing 2/3 of all tomatoes in the U.S. However, on July 14, 2025, the U.S. officially announced the termination of the 2019 agreement with Mexico to exempt tomatoes from customs duties. At first glance, the decision may seem harmless, only 17%. But such harmless duties became a catalyst for what followed.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Initially, it seemed like a technical issue. Some political analysts even claimed that the market would remain unchanged. However, the consequences were not long in coming. First, small shops and supermarkets began to see price increases for tomatoes. In some states where dependence on Mexican supplies was particularly high, the price per kilogram jumped by 30%, and then by 40%. The problem is that these tomatoes are not just fruit. They are part of our culture, our way of life, said a food security researcher from New York. Americans, accustomed to the cheapness and availability of Mexican tomatoes, are now facing shortages and sharp price increases.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Small businesses began to close as a result. Restaurants, cafes, and retail chains that used tomatoes, a key ingredient in their dishes, found themselves in economic crisis. Some chains were forced to replace fresh tomatoes with canned or artificial substitutes, which affected the quality of their dishes. Consumers also suffered as a result. The cost of salads, pizzas, and many other popular dishes rose sharply, while quality deteriorated significantly.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
But that's not all. The tariffs have affected more than just the food market. It turns out that workers who worked on Mexican farms in the U.S. are now facing mass layoffs. Latin American workers, primarily from Florida and Texas, lost their jobs because farmers, trying to reduce losses, began to close their businesses. This problem is even a concern in Mexico itself. According to sources, more than 150,000 jobs have been lost, which is exacerbating social discontent.
with Elon Musk's views and weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
What was Mexico's response? Instead of entering into open confrontation, the Mexican authorities decided to act cautiously but decisively. There were no loud protests, demonstrations, or political statements. Mexico began to gradually redirect its supplies to Canada. Without unnecessary words or propaganda, Mexican farmers began signing contracts with Canadian companies and organizing logistics routes across the Canadian border that were not subject to U.S. inspections or duties. According to sources in the Canadian government, in just the first few months of 2025, the volume of Mexican goods such as tomatoes, peppers, berries, and other vegetables increased significantly in Canadian supermarkets. This quiet and silent change of course was no accident. Mexico prepared in advance for this turn of events by building not only railroads across the northern border, but also opening new warehouses and refrigeration facilities. Canadian businessmen were understanding of the need to create new logistics chains, offering Mexico more stable and long-term contracts. While the US was quick to accuse Mexico of dumping, Canada, with its more moderate policies and stable economic system, became an attractive partner for Mexican businesses. Mexico quietly established new economic relations with Canada without breaking any rules or creating conflicts, but providing itself with a new, more reliable and stable market. Canadian supermarkets began actively purchasing Mexican tomatoes, signing long-term contracts, and setting up new logistics routes. This was not just a profitable move for business, it was a signal to the whole world Mexico no longer needs the US as its main partner. Thus, the economic shift triggered by the 17% tariff was not just a step backward for the US. It was the beginning of the end of one of the most stable trade relationships in North American history. The stakes were high. The US risked losing not only its main source of food, but also its strategic dependence on Mexico, which was now not only redirecting its supplies, but also demonstrating to the world its ability to act independently. After the US decided to impose a 17% tariff on Mexican tomatoes, the consequences of this move began to unfold in a completely unexpected direction. Instead of responding to the sanctions with economic measures or loud political statements, Mexico quietly but confidently embarked on a path to create a new trade alliance with Canada. This was not just a trade reorientation, but a real economic revolution that signaled to the whole world that global trade networks can change faster than we are used to thinking. As for the Canadian government, it welcomed this change with open arms. Unlike the US, where the trade war turned into a confrontation of interests at the political level, Canada continued to maintain stable and constructive relations with Mexico. Canada immediately understood that this situation could be the key to its future economic stability and did not waste any time. Just a few weeks after the tariff on Mexican tomatoes was introduced, Canadian supermarkets began actively signing contracts with Mexican farmers, guaranteeing long-term supplies. Surprisingly, however, all this happened without any fanfare or loud statements. Canada did not make a political issue out of what was obvious. Stability and predictability are what matter to any partner. While trade conflicts in the US were becoming increasingly tense and unstable, Canada demonstrated a peaceful approach. By establishing new logistics routes and distribution networks, they began to build a strategic supply chain with Mexico. According to experts, many American manufacturers who previously had no outlet in the Canadian market now found themselves in a situation where their goods were simply not needed. Mexico, focusing its efforts on Canada, left the American market, leaving a void that was immediately filled by other countries. Canadian companies were happy to get involved in building the logistics infrastructure. Markets in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal became major hubs for processing and distributing fresh tomatoes from Mexico. Goods that were once exclusive to American consumers are now commonplace on Canadian store shelves. For Mexico, this was a strategic move that brought not only economic benefits but also political recognition. Canadian authorities supported and encouraged such initiatives, creating a stable and transparent business environment. But what was even more surprising was how Mexico tailored its responses to US sanctions. No one expected a country accustomed to dependence on the world's largest market to build a new supply chain so quickly and confidently. Meanwhile, a new, more independent economy began to emerge in Mexico. Mexican farmers, who had relied on the US as their main buyer for many years, now looked to Canada, which was happy to take on this role. Canadian stores immediately began signing new contracts, offering Mexican producers more favorable terms. Unlike the US, where tariffs and sanctions often change with political cycles, Canada demonstrated stability and trust. The strategy agreed with Canada was not only about logistics but also about strengthening trust. Long-term contracts became the norm, which significantly increased Canada's attractiveness as a new trading partner. Mexico did not limit itself to tomatoes. Following tomatoes, other agricultural products began to arrive in Canada, such as peppers, strawberries, and avocados. All this was accompanied by improvements in infrastructure. Unlike the US, where thousands of workers lost their jobs, Mexico was able to move its production base to Canada, which was beneficial for both sides. In addition, due to the removal of tax and logistical barriers, Mexican farmers were able to reduce their production costs by 15 to 20%, which also gave them a competitive advantage in the new market. The relationship between Mexico and Canada became an example for other countries that were following this process. Not only the Mexican economy, but also the economies of other countries began to change their perception of the US as a trading partner. For example, EU countries that began to look for more stable trade routes started to review their strategies. Mexico showed the world that it is possible to build an independent trade network without dependence on the US. This was a challenge for all global economies, especially those that had become accustomed to relying on the US market. Mexico did not make loud statements or create protest movements, it simply took action. Thanks to this example, other countries, such as Brazil and Colombia, began to view Canada as a new market for their products. This led Canada to build stronger economic ties with Latin America, which in turn had an impact on global trade. What was particularly interesting was that this process unfolded amid global uncertainty, when many countries were looking for ways to minimize political and economic risks. Canadian companies actively signed contracts with Mexican farmers and began investing in local infrastructure. This trend was picked up not only by large corporations, but also by small and medium-sized businesses, which also became part of the supply chain. The stability offered by Canada became not only an economic benefit but also a symbol of the importance of a long-term approach to trade relations. Mexico, having decided on a strategic restructuring of its export network, did not simply redirect the flow of goods to Canada. This was a turning point for all of North America, and real consequences for global supply chains and the US domestic economy soon began to emerge. By 2026, Mexico had shifted nearly 48% of its fresh tomato shipments to Canada. And this was not just a business issue. It was a challenge not only for the US but for global trade as a whole, demonstrating how quickly a country that had recently been relied upon as a supplier to one of the world's largest markets was able to find an alternative. For many, this came as a surprise. Mexico used the moment of crisis not just to survive the economic blow, but to increase its economic independence and demonstrate to other countries that stability and predictability are paramount. The Canadian authorities, quickly realizing the potential of the new partnership, provided Mexican goods with better conditions for export. In particular, government subsidies for transportation and the creation of new warehouse complexes in Toronto and Montreal played a role. This significantly reduced logistics costs, and new contract agreements with major Canadian supermarkets guaranteed stable demand for Mexican products. Mexico has, in essence, begun to build a new, more balanced export model. But it wasn't just the economy and logistics that were key factors. The foreign policy situation in Canada and the US also changed dramatically. By maintaining stable relations with Mexico, Canada deprived the US of the ability to manipulate its neighbor on trade issues. Problems with the US began to mount. The White House administration tried to justify its actions by claiming that tariffs were a measure to protect American farmers. However, according to economists, such measures do more than just undermine trust. They weaken the very foundation of global trade, where mutual commitments and trust in partners have always played a decisive role. Mexico, in turn, used this moment to strengthen its role as not only an agricultural but also a strategic trading partner for other countries. After all, it became clear to many Latin American countries that the US was no longer as stable and reliable a partner as it had been in the past. Mexico now had the opportunity to develop alternative markets, and Canada began to be considered one of the main strategic allies in North America.